Every story has its moment. Mine comes at 1,000 subscribers. Subscribe and be here when the story is finally told. The investigation begins not in the air, but hours after the mission, inside a quiet briefing room on an English bomber base still operating under blackout conditions. The room smells of oil, damp wool, and cigarette smoke. Maps of Western Europe cover the walls, marked with grease pencil routes and flak belts. Intelligence officers, engineering staff, and operations planners gather with clipped movements and restrained voices, each accustomed to loss but obligated to account for it. This is not an inquiry driven by curiosity, but by responsibility, determining why one aircraft returned when doctrine suggested it should not have. The bomber at the center of the case is a late-war B-17, part of a daylight strategic bombing mission flown under established 8th Air Force procedures. Its crew consists of men in their early to mid-20s, most with fewer than 10 combat missions completed. The aircraft commander is a trained civilian pilot turned officer, methodical by nature, with no reputation for recklessness. His co-pilot is younger, recently checked out on type, still internalizing emergency procedures under live conditions. The gunners are a mix of farm boys and city recruits, trained intensively but never prepared for prolonged isolation. None of them are exceptional by record or reputation. That fact becomes important later. The mission plan itself is routine. A high-altitude approach, tight box formation, timed rendezvous with fighter escorts, and expected interception over known Luftwaffe response zones. Early flak bursts damage the bomber's right wing structure and sever part of the intercom system. Engine output drops. Airspeed declines. Formation discipline demands consistency, and a lead aircraft cannot adjust for a single lagging bomber without exposing the group. The decision is automatic, not emotional. The damaged aircraft slips out of position and falls behind alone. From a crew's perspective, the moment of separation is quiet and unmistakable. The pilot feels the aircraft respond sluggishly. The co-pilot watches the formation move ahead, unable to close the distance. Gunners report intermittent power loss. There is no panic, but there is an immediate awareness that they are now operating outside protection. Training takes over. Guns are checked. Ammunition counts are confirmed. The navigator recalculates headings with incomplete data. Each man understands his role narrows when isolation begins. On the ground, this moment is recorded only as a notation in a formation integrity report. Operations officers mark the bomber as straggler, damaged, probable loss. No special attention is assigned. Hundreds of aircraft are airborne. The system is designed to absorb attrition without emotional engagement. German fighter control, however, reacts differently. Radar plots and visual observers identify the separated bomber within minutes. To them, it represents a clear tactical opportunity. Interceptor units are vectored toward it with the assumption that it will not require prolonged effort. This assumption, though not yet analyzed, becomes the first silent pressure point in the case. Back at the Allied base, hours later, the bomber returns. Its landing is rough, controlled only through remaining hydraulics. Ground crews stare openly. The aircraft shows structural tearing, multiple penetration points, and evidence of sustained attack rather than a single engagement. The crew exits slowly, faces drawn, movements mechanical. Their emotional state is restrained but heavy. They do not speak of victory. They speak of survival, of systems failing one by one, of counting minutes rather than enemies. This return triggers the investigation's opening phase. Intelligence officers are assigned not to celebrate, but to explain. Engineering staff are tasked with documenting how the aircraft remained intact. The immediate goal is narrow and practical. Identify survivability factors that might apply to other crews. No one, at this stage, considers enemy losses. No one suspects a wider impact. The pressure lies in the unspoken question shared by everyone in the room: why this aircraft came back when so many others did not. The chapter closes with the bomber secured under guard, its damage photographed and logged, its crew sent for medical checks and debriefing. Officially, the case is about endurance and structural resilience. Unofficially, It carries weight because it contradicts expectation. The investigation begins calmly, professionally, and without drama. But beneath that surface is the quiet awareness that accepted assumptions may no longer fully explain what occurred in the air that day. The first formal assessments begin before the bomber's engines have fully cooled. Engineering teams move along the fuselage with clipboards and measuring tools, marking entry points, counting ruptures, tracing stress fractures where metal has stretched but not failed. Their work is precise and unemotional, driven by checklists refined over years of loss. The aircraft is treated less as a survivor and more as an anomaly that must be explained before it misleads future planning. Every hole is photographed. Every failure is logged. No one speculates aloud. Parallel to this, intelligence staff compile preliminary air combat summaries using radio transcripts, escort reports, and time-indexed radar plots. These documents describe the mission in clean language. Interception occurred as expected. Enemy fighter activity was heavy. Losses presumed within normal parameters. The isolated bomber appears only briefly in these records, categorized as damaged and separated, with an assumption that it was engaged repeatedly because it was vulnerable. The underlying belief is simple and widely accepted. Once a bomber is visibly crippled, its fate is only delayed, not uncertain. Across the channel, German fighter units conduct their own debriefings under similar constraints. Pilots file reports after landing, some still wearing flight gear streaked with oil and exhaust residue. Their language is confident, procedural, and shaped by doctrine. Several pilots independently describe attacking the same heavy bomber, noting smoke, loss of altitude, and reduced speed. Each report ends with a variation of the same conclusion. The aircraft was no longer combat effective and was expected to go down. No single pilot claims a clean, immediate destruction, but the cumulative picture satisfies squadron intelligence officers. The bomber is listed as destroyed in principle, even without visual confirmation of impact. This assumption influences decisions made during the engagement itself. Fighter controllers, receiving these reports in sequence, continue to assign additional aircraft to the same target. The rationale is efficiency. Finishing a damaged bomber removes a threat and boosts confirmed kill counts. What is not questioned is whether repeated attack passes against an already compromised but still firing aircraft increase risk. The doctrine prioritizes certainty over economy. Back on the Allied base, the bomber crew undergoes individual debriefings. Each man recounts the engagement from his own station, timelines overlapping but never perfectly aligning. Gunners describe silhouettes approaching through cloud breaks and smoke, firing until barrels overheated or power failed. The pilot recalls holding the aircraft steady beyond what he believed the airframe could tolerate, focusing only on keeping it level long enough to maintain control. None of them report confirmed kills. Their tone is cautious, almost dismissive of their own actions. They assume the enemy disengaged because fuel ran low or escorts appeared. They do not imagine that their defensive fire altered the course of the interception. These statements reinforce existing assumptions rather than challenge them. Intelligence officers note the crew's lack of claims and treat it as further evidence that the bomber's survival was circumstantial rather than consequential. The working conclusion remains that German pilots broke off once the aircraft was clearly doomed, shifting attention elsewhere. No follow-up is ordered. The case appears administratively complete. The next phase begins quietly, driven not by suspicion, but by routine reconciliation. Allied intelligence units responsible for daily loss assessments receive updated German aircraft loss summaries through intercepted communications, neutral country reports, and post-strike reconnaissance patterns. These figures are reviewed alongside Allied escort claims and radar timelines, a standard process meant to refine estimates rather than reopen closed cases. At first glance, the numbers appear ordinary. Then discrepancies begin to stand out. German fighter losses for the sector show an unusual distribution. Several aircraft are listed as lost without clear cause, recorded hours after the main interception window. A small number are marked as failed recoveries, pilots returning damaged, attempting landing, and crashing short of base. Others are categorized as operational losses during withdrawal. None are attributed to bomber defensive fire in that sector. The classifications are technically valid, but their timing overlaps too closely with the engagement involving the isolated bomber. An Allied analyst, experienced in loss pattern correlation rather than air combat, flags the cluster for secondary review. His role is not investigative in the dramatic sense. He is tasked with preventing statistical drift from distorting long-term assessments. He compares gun camera archives from German fighters obtained earlier in the war with current Allied escort footage. In several reels, attacks end abruptly, aircraft rolling away without visible cause. One camera cuts mid-pass, the image shaking violently before going dark. At the time of capture, these clips were dismissed as film failure or evasive maneuvering. Now, viewed alongside loss timings, they carry more weight. Engineering officers revisit the bomber's damage reports with a narrower focus. They note patterns and impact angles suggesting close-range engagements, repeated from multiple vectors. Some penetrations show signs of having struck attacking aircraft before entering the fuselage, fragments embedded at angles inconsistent with long-range fire. This does not indicate deliberate targeting, only proximity. The bomber had been engaged repeatedly at distances closer than doctrine recommended. The crew is brought back for supplemental questioning, not because they are suspected of withholding information, but because the data no longer fits comfortably within existing explanations. The men answer carefully. Fatigue is evident, but so is restraint. They describe long stretches of firing without visible effect, of watching fighters pull away trailing smoke and assuming they would recover. None report collisions. None claim destruction. Their recollections are fragmented by noise, vibration, and the narrow fields of view from their stations. What emerges is not a narrative of success, but of endurance under sustained pressure. At the same time, intelligence officers reviewing German squadron activity notice another inconsistency. Fighter units assigned to the sector report lower availability in subsequent days than expected. Maintenance logs suggest airframes grounded due to damage rather than routine wear. Replacement requests exceed the losses officially attributed to combat. These administrative details, usually buried in weekly summaries, suggest that the engagement's cost may have been underestimated. The prevailing theory shifts cautiously. Analysts consider whether the German losses resulted from internal factors, overstress during aggressive maneuvering, fuel mismanagement, or formation breakdowns during withdrawal. This explanation aligns with doctrine and avoids attributing undue effectiveness to a single bomber's defensive fire. It is adopted provisionally, satisfying the need for order while leaving room for adjustment. Still, unease remains. The bomber's isolation, the duration of enemy commitment, the pattern of delayed losses, all point toward a cumulative effect that has not been fully accounted for. No one yet states this openly. The pressure at this stage is professional rather than emotional, driven by the obligation to ensure records reflect reality closely enough to inform future operations. The chapter concludes with the case widened but unresolved. The investigation now sits in an uncomfortable middle ground, too complex to dismiss, too incomplete to define. Assumptions made earlier are no longer sufficient, but no definitive alternative has been established. The evidence suggests that something within the engagement has been misread, and until that gap is addressed, the record remains technically complete, yet fundamentally uncertain. Yet small inconsistencies begin to surface at the margins. Timing data shows a higher than expected concentration of German fighters in one sector for an extended period. Radar plots indicate repeated vectors toward the same slow-moving return track rather than dispersal toward the main formation. These details are noted but not prioritized. In a campaign measured by tonnage dropped and aircraft lost, such deviations are easily absorbed into statistical noise. The pressure in this phase of the investigation is subtle but persistent. Analysts are aware that accepting assumptions without verification carries consequences, but they are also constrained by workload and precedent. The bomber's return has already been explained well enough to move on. Still, the volume of engagement suggested by the damage does not fully align with the enemy's reported certainty of destruction. The question is not yet articulated, but it exists. If the aircraft was already considered lost, why did so many fighters continue to commit to it? The chapter closes with reports filed, aircraft damage documented, and both sides quietly confident in their conclusions. The bomber is categorized as a rare but explainable survivor. The German losses for the day are recorded under familiar headings: mechanical failure, operational accident, unknown cause. No connection is drawn. The investigation remains narrow, controlled, and incomplete, resting on assumption that as the inquiry deepens when a new source of information becomes available through routine prisoner processing rather than any targeted effort. Several German fighter pilots, captured over separate operations and held at different facilities, are interviewed weeks apart under standardized procedures. The interrogations are methodical, conducted by officers trained to minimize confrontation and extract operational detail rather than confession. The pilots are not questioned about the bomber directly. They are asked about tactics, fuel limitations, damage tolerance, and withdrawal procedures. Only later are their answers compared. A pattern emerges across accounts that were never intended to intersect. Multiple pilots describe engaging a single heavy bomber that remained airborne longer than expected despite visible damage. Each recalls believing the aircraft was already finished, its descent only delayed by momentum or crew indecision. One pilot describes closing to very short range to confirm destruction, taking return fire that struck his engine cowling. He continued the pass, convinced the bomber would not survive long enough for the damage to matter. Another recounts breaking off after control response degraded, assuming structural failure would complete the outcome without further effort. None of the pilots frame their experiences as unusual. Their tone is professional, almost dismissive, shaped by training that prioritized certainty over caution. Yet several describe the same after effect: increasing vibration, partial instrument failure, or control stiffness appearing minutes after disengagement rather than immediately. One pilot reports attempting to land with an aircraft that had responded normally during combat, only to lose hydraulic pressure on approach and crash short of the field. At the time, the incident was logged as a landing accident. These testimonies prompt a reassessment of how losses were categorized. Intelligence officers revisit German records previously labeled as non-combat related. When aligned with engagement timelines, several incidents fall within the window of sustained contact with the isolated bomber. The distinction between combat loss and operational failure begins to blur. Damage sustained but not immediately fatal proves more significant than originally acknowledged. The investigation's tone remains controlled, but its direction shifts. Analysts recognize that earlier conclusions relied too heavily on visual confirmation standards that did not account for delayed failure. The assumption that a bomber's defensive fire was only effective when immediately decisive is quietly discarded. Instead, attention turns to cumulative damage and pilot judgment under pressure. Engineering specialists contribute further context. They explain that heavy bomber defensive guns, even when inaccurately fired under stress, could inflict subtle but critical damage: coolant leaks, control cable fraying, fuel line punctures, that would not force immediate disengagement but would compromise recovery. This aligns with the pilot's accounts and with maintenance records showing aircraft grounded after landing attempts rather than lost outright in the air. Responsibility becomes a more explicit theme within the investigation. German doctrine encouraged persistence against damaged bombers to secure confirmed kills. Allied doctrine assumed that defensive fire primarily served to deter rather than destroy. Both assumptions are now under strain. Neither side appears reckless, but both relied on incomplete models of risk. The bomber crew is informed only partially of these developments. They're not praised or interrogated aggressively. Instead, they are asked to clarify firing durations, ammunition depletion, and moments when attackers appeared to disengage unexpectedly. The men respond with caution. They express discomfort at the implication that their actions may have contributed to unseen outcomes. None frame this as achievement. The weight they carry is quiet and unresolved. By the end of this phase, the investigation has corrected several structural gaps in its understanding. Losses previously written off are reclassified. Timelines are adjusted. The engagement is no longer viewed as a simple case of survival amid failure, but as a prolonged interaction shaped by misjudgment on both sides. What remains is to determine the full scope of consequence, not as a matter of credit, but of accuracy. The chapter closes with revised files circulating through intelligence channels, marked for final attribution review. The process remains restrained and procedural, but its implications are heavier than before. The record is being rewritten not to elevate a single aircraft, but to acknowledge how error, persistence, and delayed effect alter the outcome of a single engagement in ways no one initially intended. The final analytical phase begins with consolidation rather than discovery. Intelligence sections bring together revised German loss records, Allied engagement timelines, ammunition expenditure logs, and engineering assessments into a single working file. This is not treated as a celebration of effectiveness or an indictment of failure, but as a requirement to close the record accurately. The emphasis is on causality, not credit. Each German aircraft loss, previously categorized as mechanical failure, operational accident, or unknown cause, is reviewed individually. Investigators compare last known positions, radio transmissions, reported damage, and recovery attempts. Patterns emerge with increasing clarity. Several aircraft that returned from the engagement show evidence of damage consistent with heavy machine gun fire, punctured coolant systems, severed control lines, compromised hydraulics, none of which would necessarily prevent continued flight during combat, but all of which would degrade survivability afterward. These failures align closely with the bomber's documented firing arcs and periods of sustained defensive activity. The attribution process is deliberately conservative. Analysts resist the temptation to draw broad conclusions from incomplete data. Each case must meet a threshold: temporal proximity to the engagement, plausible line of fire, and a failure mode consistent with delayed damage. Where uncertainty remains, losses are left unassigned. Even so, the number of reclassified aircraft grows steadily. By the end of the review, 17 German fighters are linked, directly or indirectly, to damage sustained during repeated attack passes against the isolated bomber. This conclusion forces a reassessment of earlier assumptions on both sides. The belief that a single bomber's defensive fire could not meaningfully affect an interception effort is no longer tenable. Equally, the German expectation that persistence against a damaged target reduced risk is shown to be flawed. The engagement becomes a case study in cumulative effect, how repeated, seemingly inconclusive actions can shape outcomes beyond immediate perception. The bomber crew is informed of the findings in a controlled setting. There is no ceremony, no formal commendation. An intelligence officer explains the results plainly, emphasizing that attribution does not imply intent or awareness. The crew listens in silence. Some struggle to reconcile the findings with their own memories, which consist largely of noise, smoke, and the effort to keep the aircraft flying. Others express discomfort at the scale of consequence attached to actions they experienced only as routine defensive duty. None respond with pride. The prevailing emotion is gravity. Command staff review the case with similar restraint. The findings are circulated as an internal memorandum rather than a public account. Recommendations focus on doctrine, the need to reconsider assumptions about damaged aircraft, the risks of overcommitment, and the importance of accounting for delayed failure in loss assessments. No tactical directives are rewritten on the basis of a single incident, but the case is retained for training and analytical reference. As the attribution process concludes, the investigation reaches a point of clarity without triumph. The engagement is now understood not as an anomaly or a statistical error, but as a convergence of training, persistence, and misjudgment. Responsibility is distributed rather than assigned. The record reflects this balance, avoiding language that elevates or condemns. The chapter closes with the case file nearing completion. What began as a question of survival has become a matter of accurate counting. The focus shifts away from how the bomber returned and toward what that return revealed about doctrine, about expectation, and about the unseen costs carried by decisions made under pressure. The case moves toward closure through administrative procedure rather than ceremony. The completed file is circulated among intelligence, operations, and training commands with restricted distribution. Its language is deliberately restrained. There are no superlatives, no emphasis on numbers beyond what the evidence supports. The purpose is not to reshape the narrative of the air war, but to correct a specific record and preserve the lessons embedded within it. Final attribution tables are approved after independent review. Each linked loss is annotated with the limits of certainty, the nature of the damage, and the reasoning behind its classification. Where evidence remains circumstantial, that uncertainty is preserved rather than resolved through assumption. The total figure is accepted not as a measure of success, but as a cumulative outcome shaped by timing, proximity, and persistence. The investigation makes clear that none of this was visible to those involved at the time. Operational planners absorb the findings with mixed reactions. Some view the case as confirmation that established doctrine underestimated defensive lethality under prolonged engagement. Others focus on the opposing error, the tendency to treat damaged aircraft as safe targets rather than ongoing threats. No immediate doctrinal overhaul follows. Instead, the case is incorporated into internal studies on risk escalation, misclassification of losses, and the limits of visual assessment in air combat. The bomber crew returns to routine duty. Their aircraft is written off as beyond economical repair, stripped for usable components, and removed from the flight line. The men receive no additional recognition beyond what was already standard for completing a mission. In private conversations, some express relief that the matter is settled. Others carry unease, aware that their survival intersected with consequences they neither sought nor understood at the time. There is no resolution to that feeling, only acceptance. On the German side, post-war records later reflect similar restraint. The engagement appears only as a footnote within broader analyses of late-war interception losses. The pilots involved are not singled out for error or failure. Their actions are understood within the constraints of doctrine and pressure, shaped by training that emphasized decisiveness over caution. Accountability, where it exists, is institutional rather than personal. The investigation closes with a final summary, noting that the engagement's significance lay not in its scale, but in its clarity. It demonstrated how assumptions, once accepted, can shape behavior in ways that amplify loss without delivering certainty. It showed how training functions under stress, not as a set of heroic choices, but as repeated execution of learned responses. And it confirmed that outcomes in war are often distributed across time, visible only when records are aligned long after the event. The file is archived. No further action is recommended. The bomber's return is no longer treated as an anomaly, nor as a symbol. It stands as a resolved case within the larger machinery of war, one engagement among many, fully accounted for, leaving behind not triumph, but understanding.